Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Emma Lennard
Hi, Kieran.
and Seamus Gibbons.
Hi.
It's fantastic to have you both here. We're going to talk about curriculum and perhaps how we might think about our sequencing, amongst other things. But I thought maybe it'd be good to begin with a bit about who you are and how you got to where you are now.
Hi, everybody. My name's Emma Lennard. I am a teacher, and I've had the fortunate experience to be able to sort of specialize in curriculum over the last sort of 10 years. And I met Shay on a brilliant day when he walked into my classroom, and we ended up teaching together in a school in Paddington. And I can't really believe that we, 10 years down the line or longer, that we've written a book together because we were just two teachers trying to muddle our way through a school that didn't have a strong curriculum at all or any curriculum to speak of. So yeah, we've got to a point in our careers that we've got a bit more experience, and we wrote sequencing the primary curriculum because we wanted to really help the teachers that we were when we met each other.
For myself, I'm currently an executive principal for a large multi-academy trust. I've got four primary schools at the moment that I've got overall responsibility for, all central London schools. And I also work as a skit lead for a multi-academy trust, and my role is the primary lead. So I very much oversee training teachers, new to the profession for their first training year. And then prior to that, I've worked in Westminster in two different schools there, and that's where Emma, myself, and Emma are colleagues there. And then my teaching career, it's actually always been in London, but it was a little bit further out at Hillingdon. And then following on from what Emma said, a lot of the motivation around putting this book together was certainly around our own reflections, but equally, because I spend a lot of time with trainee teachers and working with trainee teachers, I've got a really close lens on the framework that they're supposed to learn and that they're supposed to know. And equally, the inspection framework that us as providers are judged against. And a recent shift is an expectation that trainees have got a much deeper understanding of the curriculum, which makes it challenging at primary. There's an expectation that they will be able to hold conversations with experts in a subject. There's an expectation that they'll be able to have the secure subject knowledge. They'll be able to understand what they should be teaching and when they should be teaching. And we understood the reality that there's a lot of different elements that they need to know. Wouldn't it be really helpful if there was a resource available? So when they are looking at geography or history or so on, that is potentially a chapter in a book that they can go and read that will guide them through some of the research, guide them through some potential questions, think around sequencing with some really practical examples. And that would then really support them to have a secure foundation, a training year, which would hopefully carry them through to the ECT year and so on.
Fantastic. I mean, it's lovely to have both of you here. I mean, I'm going to go off piece straight away. Seamus, what brought you over to England? Was it like me, the paucity of teaching jobs back home, or was it just to see the world?
It was one of those things when I thought, obviously, teaching in Ireland, primary teaching, that there's a real shortage of jobs. So there isn't a whole lot of primary jobs available. And we thought actually coming to London for a year would be a really good opportunity to come and sort of live in a big city. And 20 plus years later, I haven't found my way back, essentially. And I mean, it does help that it is like hopping on a bus. So every time, I do need to go home or they come over to visit, it's so quick. But by the time I came over here, because I started in Hillingdon, I oh, I've done 2 years teaching there. And I thought, well, I haven't really gotten a taste of, the heart of London. Let me do another year. And then I became another year and another year and another year. And then, I haven't found my way back.
Yeah, I totally get that. I mean, you guys have started to almost bridge into my first question. I mean, what were your motivations for writing sequencing the primary curriculum, and how did your own experience as teachers or educators shape the book?
Well, Shay got in touch with me one day because he was having to, he was looking at four materials for, his ITT students to learn about curriculum from. And I think what we've both found when we've worked with trainee teachers is, there are lots of books out there, and there's lots of academic research out there that you can read, but the challenge is kind of filtering through and pulling through the things that a teacher on a training course with loads of pressure, primary particularly, it's not necessarily your subject that you're a specialist in. And so for some teachers, they're expected to learn things that they perhaps haven't got GCSE in that subject. So yeah, Shay got in touch with me one day and was like, should we write some stuff? Let's write some content for the ITT course that Shay runs. And so that's where it kind of came from, because we were like, let's try and meet the needs of trainee teachers, providing something really sort of concise. It's quite hard because you need to give them enough, but not too much, but enough that's going to prepare them really well. So that's where it kind of came from. And then as we were pulling some things together, we kind of thought, maybe other people might find this helpful. So then we went to a publisher and sort of pitched. But it really was, we were just sort of two teachers kind of going, oh, let's have a go at this. But it seemed to be well received. But that's where it came from. And I think we've always held in our minds when we've been writing, what did we need to know? There's lots of stuff that's really nice to know and that we hope teachers will discover, one day, when they've got a few more years under their belt and they've got that kind of brain space to learn a bit more. But what do they actually need to know in the moment? What did we need to know when we were stood there, in our classroom in that first year? What did we need to know about the curriculum? So that's kind of where it came from.
Yeah, I think we were it's really helpful sometimes to reflect a few years later when you're looking at the primary curriculum and you're thinking, actually, we've got these people new to the profession. You need to know names of artists, you need to know how to do sculpturing, you need to know how to conduct scientific experiments. Then maybe after lunch, manage a hockey game or the endless things we're expecting them to know. And I think when I reflect on my own sort of NQT, which is now ECT years, and I think of some of the lessons that I would have delivered, which wouldn't have necessarily been deemed as bad practice, but the kind of consistent, I guess, reflection for me when my children maybe weren't as successful in my more sort of novice years of teaching, probably linked back to the curriculum because, I was choosing a theme and I was trying to link everything through it rather than thinking of what they should know. And I think it's been a really positive shift that now in teacher training, we haven't really necessarily got those messages. It is much more around sequencing, but that is so overwhelming when you're trying to manage 101 other things. So I was certainly thinking, let's try and help those new to the profession so they can see there's some sort of light at the end of the tunnel, or it just gives them a starting point. So if, we always remember when we started teaching, I completely remember the first few lessons I'd done in my teacher training and spending hours and hours and hours planning and Googling the best way to teach multiply and divide by 10. That was my first lesson. And it was in 8 minutes at the start of it, is all I had to deliver. But I just remember thinking I didn't even know where to start. And that continued a lot through my training. I spent so much time Googling and researching and checking my subject knowledge, and I'm explaining it right, and what if that's wrong, and so on. And lots of different resources trying to connect it all together. And I think I would have found it really helpful if there was something I could have just read that would have guided me. And probably more than anything, just assured me and kind of given me confidence within myself that, in this lesson or within this subject, here's just some things that make it unique. And here's some resources that are maybe credible and that have been QA'd by other people that I know that, I stand a stronger chance of that resource being helpful. And maybe to support me with some questions I could ask, or, do we even know, I don't even know if I knew there was individual subject leaders when I was on teaching practice in some schools. So, we were trying to help in this particular book to say, well, actually, there will be a history leader, and here's some potential questions you can ask them. So you can do that quite early, and just to try and hold our hand, but, just fill some of that knowledge gap that does exist for all of us. So I think that was certainly sort of a key motivator for us.
Yeah, it's massive. And I think even over the course of our collective careers, things have changed, expectations have changed. And there's so much that we're sort of required to know and be sort of knowledgeable in. I mean, is there part of you that's thinking about what's going to happen as we move forward now? And are you guys considering maybe putting down your ideas for where you think curriculum needs to go to next, or did you have space within sequencing to sort of make your claim for what the future might hold? So ACTs in 5 years' time, their experience. What do you think?
I mean, look, I think it's really interesting. I think within the kind of book that we put together was very much looking at this is what trainees are expected to know now to demonstrate secure knowledge against a teaching standard and really certainly support them. We didn't go too rogue. I mean, often when we're out for a drink, we think we can, save everything and write our own curriculum in the moment. And I think, for me, there's lots of positive messages around sort of looking at some of that curriculum moving forward. And I think there certainly doesn't seem to be an approach of let's throw everything out. I think there is recognition of some of the sequencing and some of this really careful thinking around the curriculum will stay and kind of will keep that rigor. And I think that's incredibly important. But equally, I do think it is important to notice around things like sort of AI and are constantly evolving and moving forward. And you look at something like the existing computing curriculum that a lot of our young children can already master and sort of move at a faster pace than we are. So we do need to be moving forward. And I certainly would hope that it's so broad at the moment. So I would hope that they give us a little bit more space in primary as we move forward so we can get deeper in some of those subjects and some of those key aspects. But certainly, I would expect there to be more room around things like sustainability and then sort of moving towards sort of being carbon neutral. Some of those changes are, in artificial intelligence, I would certainly expect to see. But I still would hope that we keep that rigor and that logic around sort of, the importance of subjects like history and understanding how that sort of shaped the future. And here's a really logical way of us teaching it. And I think we've had some real success in early reading and phonics. And I'd hope that sort of stays really prominent. And I think the messages I've heard, and I've seen, some of the people they've selected for the panel to support, I'd hope that some of those messages would certainly remain, but equally, there's certainly some room going forward.
Just to add to that, I think one of the things for us when we were writing the book was to support teachers to really know the curriculum and therefore be able to start thinking quite critically about it. Like, why am I including this? Why am I teaching this country or this artist or this piece of music? So that they can actually start thinking about the value of what that adds to the curriculum. And I feel like that helps teachers to really kind of future-proof their curriculum because they know what's important to them. And yes, we have to deliver the national curriculum and what's specified in the national curriculum, but that's not all we deliver as schools. And sometimes, depending on your context, there'll be other things you want to include. Sometimes there'll be things that you just think, do you know what, it's really important for children to study a place in Africa because that's a really important continent and has incredible rich history and geography, but it's not in the primary curriculum for geography. But that doesn't mean I can't teach it. So what we've tried to do is talk about, the selection process of what you put in the curriculum and how, as a teacher, you are designing a curriculum for the children that you know best. We work across many different schools at the moment in our roles, and we can create a curriculum, but actually it's that class teacher at the end of the day who decides what those children will learn and what's important for those children. And I think yes, the curriculum could change and there could be different emphasis on different aspects of the curriculum, and curriculum should change. We don't want it set in stone forever. But what we do need to do is, as teachers and as professionals, is know those really important aspects of it that we want to deliver, regardless of the change. Recognize the change, but also we need to know what our children really deserve. And I think that having the time to reflect on the content of your curriculum and the sequencing, obviously it comes into it, but what should children learn? It's a brilliant question. And, actually, I think sometimes we just go straight to the national curriculum, right, what is it I have to do? Because we're busy. And, actually to just step back a bit and think, well, okay, what should an education look like for a child today? And how will that change over, the course of our careers? I think it's important to sort of have that space to think about that as well.
And I think on that, Emma, just sort of the challenge with that really, when you're any curriculum thinking, is just the acceptance that you can't teach everything. And sometimes it's harder to decide what not to teach rather than what to teach. And you will have to accept that there's going to be some really good things that you're just not going to be able to do because your time and space doesn't allow it. And I think that's often what we call cop, so often is around, especially as a team, as practitioners, you bring so many things that you're really passionate about, but there has to be an acceptance that we just can't deliver everything. And sometimes deciding what not to teach is much harder than deciding what to teach. And I don't think you'll ever reach a consensus that we've got it right. But I think it's just that constant reflection and moving on and that bigger picture and that uniqueness of the discipline and just making sure that that's getting, the value it needs to get.
I once worked with a year four teacher who'd studied medieval history as his degree, and whenever he came to the Vikings and the Anglo Saxons, he, the amount of stuff he was having to not teach. Oh my god!
And that's really hard, isn't it? Because you're like, this is really fascinating. I want them to know this, but we can't do everything.
Curriculum sequencing can be complex. What would you say is the most challenging aspect of ensuring a well-sequenced primary curriculum, and how can schools address this?
That's such a great question. And curriculum work is really messy. It's not obvious, there's no clear path sometimes. And I think for me, one of the really one of the most challenging things is what we've just talked about, is that specifying the curriculum. So before we even come to sequencing and thinking about what order children should learn things in, we have to be specific about what they're going to learn, because then we can sequence it. If we're trying to sequence something that's not clear, or hasn't really had any sort of deep thinking done around it, then the job is just too complicated. So I think in order to be able to sequence a curriculum, it has to be specific first. And I think that step is really difficult, especially, as we've said, when we're not necessarily specialists in the subjects, or if you've got people with certain passions that want to take it one direction. So I think that being specific with the curriculum is the most challenging bit. And then when we come to the sequencing of the curriculum, I think sometimes it's sort of easier in some subjects than others. Maths, I think, we're quite good at sequencing logically in maths because it's perhaps a little bit more obvious, but something like geography, sometimes it can just, the sequencing hasn't been thought through, and children are jumping from topic to topic, and they're having a really lovely time learning about rainforests, and then they might learn about rivers, and then they might be studying parrots, but nobody's actually thought, right, what is the prior knowledge children need in order to access this? And I feel like that's the next bit of sequencing, is thinking about, right, what do they need to know first before they do this? And then if we identify that stuff, where does it come? And that helps you to start pulling together that curriculum content when you're thinking, right, okay, we want to teach them about France, about Paris. What do they need to know first? Well, where have they been introduced to European geography? So then those links can kind of come in then with history, where we want them to learn about the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons. Have they got that European geography knowledge first? So I think it's that, as I'm explaining it, I'm like, it's so messy. It's really complex, it really is. But I think specifying it and then thinking about that prior knowledge, what do children need to know in order, for them to learn effectively and be successful.
Once you've got that in place, another real challenge in primary is subject knowledge, and the amount you need to know. And I think one of the things we did when we wrote the book is we put a subject knowledge audit in at the back, because again, you look at a 200-page national curriculum document, it's really overwhelming, and you can't know everything. So we were trying to think, okay, what are some of the core things we need to know? And then we had to make some judgments and some decisions that, myself and Emma just decided, actually, when we're going into our ECT year, we think it's really important, A, B, C, D, and E. Doesn't really matter. You don't know these two things. I've picked that up, but these are really fundamental aspects. And even when I bring that to my trainees now, even at that level, it's still so overwhelming, because we get caught in the education bubble, don't we? And we forget that sometimes we speak a language that not many other people speak. And people are like, what do you mean tier 2 and tier 3 words? And what do you mean graphemes and phonemes and digraphs and trigraphs? What on the volume of a shape? I haven't done that in years. And suddenly you see the first go with the self-evaluation and everything's in red. And then you say, well, actually, when we're talking about like a phoneme, this is all we mean. We're like, oh, I know that. I was like, okay. And then when we're talking about, and sometimes it's saying to the trainees, again, you can't know everything, But when you've got a really clear understanding, because even if you're thinking of something like the Romans or earthquakes, even that on its own requires such expert knowledge. But if you can be really specific and say, we're looking at these aspects of that civilization or that period in history or that aspect of geography, then you can really focus in your teachers and your newer teachers. And these are the things you really need to know. And maybe we're going to do a case study on this one area in California that you can really, study and become an expert on, rather than trying to understand everything at once. So I think, once you have that really specific content they're going to learn, and then that's in a sort of step-by-step manner that's logical, what that enables you to do then is really focus on the subject knowledge. And for us, it's making sure that we're not already speaking another language before we even start, and just helping them understand, and just remembering how overwhelming it can be when you're new to profession. And you'll hear lots of terminology and language that's very specific. And the grammar, you look at, year 6 grammar paper for the first time. If you haven't taken out, I looked at a grammar paper since you sort of GCSEs or something, and you've been off doing a degree in something else, and then suddenly, as soon as I hear like job interviews, oh, we made them sit a grammar paper. And like, well, actually, it's pretty quite cruel, because I bet they could do a lot better in that if you sort of made it more accessible to them. But like, we can teach that bit really quickly. So I do think once we have that really clear, it's then supporting that subject knowledge, and again, one of the things we tried to do in the book was to support them to understand, when it comes to subject knowledge, here's some things that will hopefully support you, and some of it guide you. And some of it is sort of reminding them, oh, you might not know, but there's actually a really useful glossary in the national curriculum that explains all that terminology for you. And that's really helpful for them, because, we can get into debates often again over the definition of many different sort of aspects of the curriculum. And I'm like, if you've got that glossary there, you're kind of in safe hands. That's there to support you and hold you and guide you. And if you're doing year 4, then it actually is a table in the curriculum that tells you very specific knowledge you need to know for your English and your maths in year 4. Focus on that for the moment, and then let's get that right. That's where you're doing your practice, and then we can come on to those other elements later. And I think just having that empathy and that understanding is really important to the newest teachers.
I think one of the powerful things about the sequencing of a curriculum, and obviously we're talking a lot about teachers who are training or ECTs, but actually, like, maybe the second year, third year into your career, that understanding the sequence of the curriculum helps you to see that bigger picture of what the curriculum looks like. And I know when I was teaching year 1, I had a bit of an idea of what happened in early years, and I knew a little bit about year 2, but if you had asked me what year 6 were doing, I didn't have a clue, because you're sort of overwhelmed at that point, and you've got enough to think about in the within the sort of phase that you're teaching in. And I think if we can support primary teachers to understand that curriculum journey, it's really important, because then they can see like their contribution to that journey. And it's not that you have to get children necessarily to understand every single thing about that kind of technique in art, because they might be coming back to it later in the curriculum. And I think that sort of clarity comes from having that really well sequenced curriculum. Then you can say, like, this is my role in this bigger picture. This is what I need to do for my children. But they're going to come back to some of these concepts in history and geography and science again and again as they work through the curriculum. And that's the bit that I think, they don't need that necessarily right at the beginning of their career, because they need to focus on the stuff that they've got to deliver. But having that sequenced curriculum allows you to kind of step back and see that bigger picture, and say, okay, well, I see this journey that my children are on now, rather than just, this is what I'm teaching and what I'm delivering. This is their experience as they work through the curriculum and as they journey through primary school.
And it feels as if both of those challenges are sort of inextricably linked. The knowledge you need, the way in which you're going to sequence that knowledge, particularly with those. I think I've heard it described as having weak grammar. Like mathematics has a high grammar or strong grammar, because the order is the order, and more or less. But with something like geography, you get a bit more flexibility. Is that awareness of the journey a prerequisite? Because I'm imagining this like 4 or 5 years where you're spending getting to grips with this stuff, maybe even longer, probably the rest of your career. But do you need that awareness of the journey first, or does that come along at the same time as both of them?
That's a great question. I feel like someone needs to know the journey. So, like, if your senior leaders or your mentor knows the journey, those more experienced teachers, it might be that you can say, trust me, there's a journey. Right now, focusing on this bit. And then you'll see, as you gradually have, gained more experience, you sort of see that. It'd be great if they can understand right from the beginning, that sort of curriculum journey. I certainly didn't at all. And it's, definitely only in the last few years having the time to kind of specialize that I've been able to say, oh, okay, I get this now. I see where this is all going. And then we can have that kind of clarity on it. I think, it's the, going back to the nice to know, need to know stuff, like it would be really nice to have that appreciation. And some people might be able to do that. But I think, if we can focus, if we can say like, trust in this journey, trust in this curriculum, but, focus on the bit that you need to do right now, get that right. And then, slowly you can start taking away those scaffolds and let them see what's there. But I don't know if you've got a different perspective on that, Shay.
No, I mean, I agree that, somebody has to know the journey. I think kind of where our more novice teachers or our newer teachers, it's probably really helpful if they can know what should have come before, because that will then enable them to know what the children should know in order to be successful, or where they are kind of so far in this journey. Ideally they'll know where to go next as well. But I was actually chatting to one of my ECTs yesterday, and we're talking about history planning that he's putting together, and he was I was very proud of him as he's telling me. I spent because I spent the last few days, look, he's year two. He's like, I was just looking at all their year one planning and what they should know, and then I've kept some of the books. I got like two of the books, and I was just looking through the books the night beforehand. So I really feel that I can begin to link with what they already know, and I thought that if I think of myself as PCT, that certainly wasn't happening, but it was quite natural to him to suddenly be curious around what they should have done in year one in history. And then that will give me hopefully a gateway in. But it's immediately getting him to think. And one of the things he did say to me was like, well, I thought they would have done this, but I can see that actually isn't covered on the year one curriculum. So I maybe would have made an assumption there. So I'm going to just add that little bit in my lesson. And I thought actually that was a really sophisticated way of thinking for somebody kind of in the second week of teaching as an ECT. I thought that was really important that you're looking at where they have been, because that enables you. Especially, I obviously work into the London schools. Mobility is very high. It's not unusual for us to have new arrivals. So it straight away put us on the radar of where there might be a gap in the knowledge, and maybe just sort of how we plugged out what we needed to do. So I think sort of, yes, absolutely where you are in that moment, especially in the earlier years, and then leaning into where they should be and what they should know, because, as we know, they're likely going to forget a chunk of that. So we need to revisit it. And then obviously where they're going to next. But I think that looking back is really important at the beginning.
And I think that the powerful thing there is the school has got a really specified, well-sequenced curriculum. So it's possible to do that. It's possible to go back and say, well, what should they have learned last year, maybe even the year before? Whereas, certainly our experience as NQT, Shay, like nobody knew what was taught when, and it was all different teachers. And, I couldn't have told you what my class, really did 2 years before or 3 years before. So I think that's the power of that sequence curriculum. Obviously, as Shay says, you're going to have some mobility, but then it's possible then to say, right, I've got a child who's not had this curriculum, so I can look back and I know exactly where their gaps are, rather than us just kind of guessing, and just being like, oh, I'm not really sure what they learned, but I'll just have a bash at this lesson today. Like, we can do better, and I think the curriculum can support us to do better.
I mean, it's actually wild thinking about it that we basically had carte blanche to teach whatever we wanted. I remember first day I moved over here, 2008, and like I'd never taught the tutors, but I never even learned who, I didn't know who the tutors were. And all of a sudden I was responsible for the curriculum. And just as you're emphasizing what has come before, what came to my mind was, well, where are our least experienced teachers going to? They're going to year 3, and they're probably going to year 7 in secondary school. So actually, those are crucial junctures between what's come before, what's come. So that really stood out to me when you emphasize the idea, what should they already know, what may have already been covered, because you could, potentially different schools, moving schools, but also quite a big jump in expectations sometimes as well. What are the best ways for teachers to create meaningful links between subjects without diluting the depth of each subject?
On the links thing, I think this is really interesting for us at primary, because we've probably all taught in schools where we've taught topics, and we've had to invent these lovely, exciting topics, and we've had to kind of grab a bit of geography and shove it in and put a bit of history, and I haven't taught much science, so I need to make it link to the topic. And really, my experience of doing that means that the topic and the links are kind of at the forefront of what you're trying to do. You're trying to make everything link. And I remember doing maths and trying to make it look like Under the Sea, because that was our topic at the moment. So we did all maths, was counting shells and stuff, and it's all lovely, it's all nice, but I feel like actually, when we're talking about sequencing the curriculum and thinking about the subject content and that subject knowledge building for children as they work through the curriculum, then those meaningful links could be completely lost. You could go down a road where you say, right, we're doing subjects at primary, and the history is going this way and the geography is going this way. But actually, the power of sequencing it carefully, specifying that content and then sequencing it carefully, means that you can say, right, what I want to do is I'm teaching this period of history, but it leans on lots of geographical knowledge. So I need to know where in the geography curriculum they've learned this, and those links can be there. If we're learning about a certain artist, what time were they alive? What was happening in the rest of the world at that time? And I feel like those meaningful links then are, they're there for you because you've aligned the content, and you can draw those links out for teachers. And often, with a very well-sequenced specified curriculum, you're making links not just within that year group, but from previous years. And you're also saying to children, okay, hold that, because next year you're going to learn something about that in geography or in RE. So I think what we need to do is think about the content and then see how that content kind of marries up. And those links will be there and they will be meaningful. And, I've been, had the privilege of doing a lot of curriculum work in the last few years, and we still are identifying links that are in the curriculum because the content is there, but we just hadn't drawn them out yet, because we've got so many different subjects. So yeah, I think it's just about making sure that the subjects kind of talk to one another and speak to one another, and that children are seeing that, yes, I'm learning geography right now, but some of my history knowledge is going to be relevant. Lots of my science knowledge is going to be relevant to what I'm doing in geography, and I can pull across from those subjects as I'm learning.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we know so much more at the moment around sort of working memory and around that appropriateness of task setting. And I often think they're two really good starting points when you're thinking around anything where it's potentially cross-curricular, where you're bringing two subjects together and you think, well, actually, is it distracting from what you want those children to learn? Or is it supporting it? Or is the working memory being distracted by that other subject than you wanted it to be? Or actually, is that enabling it to be more successful? So, there's very obvious links. If you've done a science experiment, you're going to be presenting data, then that maths lends itself really nicely, and it's absolutely worthwhile having the children focus attention on that. But you often see a lot of times, let's create a poster of all we've learned about the tutors or whatever, and that you still see that quite a lot. And of course, the children are straight away, an argument over the color and pencils and drawing the pictures, and actually lost sight of the history. And you see oftentimes when you bring in technology, you sometimes see that link being used really effectively, but then equally you could sometimes say, well, I've let them present on PowerPoint, and then before you know it, there's all sorts of effects coming in, and again, the working memories focus on something completely different. So I think it's always around, what do I want them to learn? What's the ultimate aim from this? What's unique about this discipline? And if it's meaningful, if we're going to learn about the life of an artist, then it probably makes a lot of sense to read about them and in a really accessible way. And you can use it as an example, or in your design technology, you're naturally going to find lots of ways of linking in some of that mathematical thinking that you would naturally do. But it's funny you mentioned the tutors, because my first year teaching is always the tutors. And again, I'd go from Ireland, I was like, what's going on? Who are these two families fighting over a rose? What's happening? I'm not quite sure what's going on. Oh, he has 6 wives, that'll do. And 2 of them are beheaded. That sounds really good fun. And I remember thinking, oh, the kids will enjoy that. And that's what I got distracted by. And then somebody gave me the PE curriculum. I was like, well, here's your 6 weeks of tutor dance. And I remember being in the hall doing some bizarre tutor dance with the children. And then It was some skills. I mean, God knows what was happening, but I kid you not, that was what we done, and that was, that was a scheme. And then our art was portraits of Henry VIII, and when I think about it, that was really typical. That is what we did. And basically, my once it linked to the tutors, I was going to be fine. And actually, the more creative that could be, the more it would be praised and welcomed. And I didn't have the subject knowledge in tutor dancing, history, or in portrait painting to be able to help my kids be successful. I mean, they probably all remember it because it's something that's probably traumatized them from their sort of early childhood and primary, but it certainly didn't make them better historians. And I think there's an element that we can take it for granted, but we've had a new teacher join our school who has come from a different country, and she said, I just can't believe that you've got everything here. And I was like, she's like, you've actually got there's timetables, there's plans, like this all makes sense in its sequence. She's like, I've never had this before, and she was kind of saying that sort of half hoarse, like, am I good to go home? Like, I kind of, it's all done, and it was kind of, very quickly gotten used to having these systems in place in our schools. But she was so grateful for it and said, it's so helpful knowing what is happening, because she was still planning everything from scratch. And she was saying, she's already spotted how the children can kind of read and write and access the curriculum at a much more sophisticated level than sort of where she's come from. And I thought it was really interesting that despite evidence and research and those things in place, and a lot of training teachers who I work with have often spent a lot of time overseas, and they come in and they find it challenging to get used to our curriculum and our approach and our structure, which was, again, kind of, and I'm saying, well, we'll have a look at the chapter, have a look at that book that's there to help you. And one of the things that we did do as part of the books in those chapters as well is we dedicate just a small section of what some of the headlines of some of the research says, because a lot of it kept coming back to task setting, small steps, keeping in a discipline, not doing too much at once. So you're kind of helping them and assuring them that it's fine for you to be at the front and delivering something really clearly and concisely to the children with a really clear objective. That's absolutely fine. And actually, the research is supporting that can be a really successful way of doing it. And novices will learn better when you deliver it that way, as opposed to someone who's more expert. And it sort of was almost instilling it because I felt quite uncomfortable, I think, at the start to have all these things in place. But it's yeah, I think like that task setting is really key, and that working memory and making sure that those links are meaningful and not just there to be there, or there because it's just an easy task to make a poster and the kids will enjoy it and certainly engage with it.
And I feel like on the links thing, if you've not got a very well sequenced curriculum, if everyone's just doing their own thing, then those links might be there within the year groups, but they're not going to be there within the key stages because nobody speaks to each other and helps each other with it. And I think, like what you were saying, Shay, about a teacher arriving and lots of things are in place, like that has massive workload implications. And we know as a profession we're not in a good place in terms of recruitment and retention. And actually, if we can start saying to teachers, do you know what, guys, you don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. There's stuff in place that experienced people have put there. And I think there's massive potential for what teachers could do with their classes, with those children that they know really, really well. They've got those good relationships with them. If we give those teachers time, there could be some amazing stuff happening. But rather than saying, do you know what, here's a load of stuff, you've got to plan, you've got to research, you've got to work out, you've got to resource, actually, yes, that I know people argue that sort of a structured curriculum takes away a bit of their autonomy, but actually, like, you're free to do what you need to do with those children that you know best, rather than just, keep churning out, all these sort of plans. And with the best will in the world, a primary teacher hasn't got the time. There's not enough hours in the day to produce something of like really good quality. So I'd much rather a teacher was kind of given, the structured curriculum, the links are all in place. We know where art's going to link to geography, which is going to link to history, to science, to maths. It's all going to work really well. You as a teacher then focus on your pedagogy and, developing your understanding of how children learn and reading the research and, doing things that will really have an impact on those children that you've got the really good relationships with. So I certainly see the sort of structured curriculum. I know we've gone a bit off topic from your original question, Kieran, but that structured curriculum really being a lever for really improving the sort of working conditions within the profession, and freeing teachers up to think about the stuff that really matters to them.
Yeah, it's the space to think that it creates as well, isn't it? Because the most challenging things in the classroom require a lot of thought. And if you're too busy doing something that could already have been done, and then you build on it, it makes total sense. I mean, I was laughing there, Seamus, when we were describing your tutor, but you basically were describing my medium-term plan from that year, because I'm thinking I'm having flashbacks to the school hall. But I think, when I asked that question, when I wrote it, I was thinking, right, there must be a different way to phrase this, and I was almost ready for you to go, actually, no, this is the wrong way to think about it. But because it's a bit of a sacred cow sometimes in education, I thought I need to ask a question about it, because I'm totally on board with you guys in mathematics, even though it is so related to science, only making those links if they're absolutely necessary, if they're going to benefit the picture overall. So yeah, so I can see how it extends across the range of subjects. How do you recommend teachers handle the challenge of differing pupil starting points when it comes to sequencing learning content? I mean, Seamus, you mentioned the fact that your mobility is reasonably high, and so obviously that's going to impact on that a little, I think.
I mean, there's several things that we do, and I think ultimately it just really helps being clear on what children should already know in order to be able to access this lesson. So, one of the sort of systems we've done in our schools for our curriculum is we've identified sort of, 4 or 5 core knowledge aspects in each sort of discipline and each unit that they learn throughout. And then we've designed a cycle when the children are constantly revisiting that in a spaced out way. So even if you arrive in year 5, you will still get to see the core knowledge that's been learned in years 3, 4, and 5. And when the children come in the mornings and when the children come in after lunch, the activities are just on the board for the children to revisit straight away. And it's just a simple presentation, but then on the next slide is the answers. And I'll always say to my teachers, just give them the answers. If you can tell they don't know, they've forgotten, give them the answers. So I think that's been really helpful for us in terms of understanding and helping those children. And, I work with 4 different schools, and we now have an aligned curriculum, but they've come on at different times. And what we've often said to sort of one of the newer schools is just like tell them that knowledge, that's fine, put it up, talk about it, discuss it. That will enable them to be more successful as we go through. And we'll also think around things like home learning and revisiting and thinking how that will plug some of those gaps if needed, or if that's going to be really essential. We sometimes will do things like first language assessments to sort of assess maybe just some scientific knowledge and so on that might be there. And I think, one of the other, kind of coming back to something I've already said, I think that task setting is so important, because again, if you said year 2 to year 3, and I think that's a really sort of good example, because sometimes we make the assumption that when they come to year 3, they're all going to absolutely have the phonics and the fluent reading and the transcription and so on. And maybe a year 3 teacher hasn't had the phonics reading, but there will be children who maybe aren't able to read as fluently or write as fluently, but then they may be asked to write a diary and a history lesson, which is straight away you're setting them up to fail. So it's having that real clarity around what we want them to learn. And maybe we should talk about it, or maybe they can respond in their first language. And equally, if you have that core knowledge, it's just being really clear. And we'll say this with our teachers, if they remember these 2, 3 things from the lesson, then they're set up to be really successful as they work through the curriculum, and they set up to be really successful as they go into year 7. We're going to give them ample opportunity to learn way more than those sort of 3, 4 things. But actually, if you're bare minimum, and it's a bit like knowledge organizers, isn't it? They've kind of gone a bit out of control, because I do remember what I quite liked about knowledge organizers at the start is they're really simple. And it was like, this is the standard that every single child is going to know, even if they're on the send register new. And then suddenly they just became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and we've lost sight. Whereas I think sort of that's a really useful tool, if we remember its original purpose, is to let's have the aim that every child understands and can discuss and remember this really well. But then when you do have new children arriving, you can then really quickly give a pack of knowledge organizers to the families and say, this might be some of the history or geography or PE that they missed. And that can help them be really successful. And I think in one of my schools, we do have a special unit, which is for, really complex needs. And I think I'm kind of I do think it is really important. You know, we do know that the kind of profile of schools and there is much more complex and needs coming into our mainstream schools. And I think one of the challenges I found with that, and one of the really interesting aspects is that their needs are so bespoke and so unique, and but they're still entitled to a curriculum. So there will be some things. So like one of my skills, we do Mandarin, and you know, obviously we have some children who are extremely complex needs. They don't do the Mandarin, but they have a really special speech and language program that sort of enables them and supports them. But they will still get access to some subjects like the history. But what we'll instead do is think of the tier 1 and tier 2 words that we want them to really form and understand, and that's still carefully planned. So it's still very specific to their learning needs, and but we're thinking around actually that's going to be real success if they've developed some of the historical vocabulary that links into their communication and language needs. And I think certainly in my own schools and seeing sort of some children as they're entering is that we do need to be more adept at meeting the needs of some of our most complex learners that may, you know, 5, 6, 7 years that there would have been space and specialist provision for them, but there isn't. So we need to understand of how we meet their curriculum needs within the mainstream classroom. And I think, you know, we've done some work with things like speech and language therapists around, okay, look, you know, they're going to be learning X in history or science. Let's think around what we can get them to be successful with, still keeping the discipline, but supporting communication and language and so on. And I think that's been sort of a really interesting sort of lens for me. So I think that's obviously one end of the spectrum, but I think the other end is just having that real sort of core content clear. I don't know what you think, Emma.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the on this subject, we need to think about like what we as teachers can and can't control, and like those gaps will be there. There's not much we can do about that. So what can we do as teachers? And I think actually one of the things we can do is just make sure our curriculum is brilliant, make sure it's really purposeful, make sure it's really well considered. Everything in there has a role, everything in there contributes something, and that we're not just kind of making things up and pulling things from everywhere, because that's, you know, there will be some children that can cope with that kind of curriculum, right? The children that have got, you know, stuff coming in from elsewhere, books at home, experiences at home, etc. But actually, when we think about those children that their only real shot is what they're going to learn at school, like, let's make it amazing. Let's really think about it and know that we're doing the absolute best we can for them. And I think, you know, that we've got to sort of think about the mission of our curriculum. And actually at primary level, for me as a primary school teacher, I'd want children to love the subjects. I'd want them to think, yeah, it's history after lunch. You know, oh, I've got computing, or oh, I've got art. Like, if you've got that passion, then, you know, that's the best thing we can really do at primary school, to give them, you know, the foundation for their future learning. And I think, you know, what we can do is just support children to feel successful. So, you know, when you were speaking earlier, Shay, about the sort of task design and thinking about how can all children be successful, like, let's not give them like a lower ability worksheet, or, you know, let's not make them feel like they're doing a different task because they can't access it. Let's think carefully about our tasks so that there's one task that all children can have a go at their different levels. And actually, you know, like you said earlier, Shay, like maybe that, you know, a child can show what they know in a different way. You know, they might not be able to write it down, but there might be a way they can tell you what they know in history, which actually is what you want to know, you know, about them. So I think it's about doing our very best with that really important curriculum work. You know, it is the sort of like bread and butter of what we're doing in education, and it can, you know, I really fundamentally believe that you can like change the course of a child's life. You get them really interested in a subject, you get them learning really well, feeling successful, they can go on to secondary school and really, really thrive. So yeah, it's not no pressure to teachers out there, but I really think the curriculum is the thing that we can do to support all children, no matter you know, their background, or no matter their starting point.
I think that ties together everything we've been talking about, because if the scaffold is in place for the teachers and there's the structure for them in which they can be successful, it's very easy to get passionate whenever you've got that foundation, because then your passion starts to snowball, and then all of a sudden you're an expert in things that you had no idea you ever would be. So I love that way of thinking about it. And I think yeah, if you guys would be happy to come back to talk about task design, would be I think be really useful, because the only person I've spoken to about it so far is Elliot.
I mean, he's the expert on it.
You'd expand my boundaries and my horizons. But my youngest is just going into year 3. He's moved across to the infant or the junior school across the road, and his brother in year 5 asked him the other day, "Have you done the chili challenges yet?" And I thought, "Hold on a second, boys. We've got a mile and a half to talk about this."
I'm going to tell you all the reasons why your teacher's wrong.
That's their choice.
We've all been there. We've all been there. And you think at the time you're doing something good because you only know what you know. And I think that's something for us to think about as people with more experience in the profession. How can we support teachers right from the beginning so they don't make the same mistakes that we made? And with all the literature available to us these days, like there's no real excuse for it anymore. We've got to make sure that whilst the time is really short, we've got to make sure that teachers are doing the right thing for the kids.
Yeah, I think there's like a reflection for the profession and especially us as leaders that there is an irony that things that we probably would have been saying was really good practice not so long ago we're now saying isn't such good practice, and there certainly was a time, and I remember I think when me and you were working in the same school, we were told, you have the child's age and that's how long you can do your teacher talk for. And carpet time you can have and then plus that on. And you'd certainly would have, potentially been graded and inadequate if you spoke too much long. And, that would have absolutely, devastated you as a professional. But certainly there were things, and with that task design, they're really engaged, like the posters, there'd be times when I would actively go and buy highlighters and have in my lessons, so the poster would look great because I was being observed, and then you'd give me a tick. And there might even some glitter and all used to come out sometimes because the more jazzy it could look, then the more kind of engaged and happy the kids were, and actually, would be really hailed as a success. Whereas now, and it's not that long ago, but that we are now saying actually that's really distracting, and for some people, and I find that, when we look at things like, you don't need to write long comments in the books anymore. For some teachers, that's almost been a crutch. And actually, but my books have always been the best books in the school, and I write great comments, and got to be taking that away from me. Then you have to have empathy with that and understand that, and especially for some who've been around, and some who were really hailed for that. And you'd be told, you're a great creative teacher, and that task design does make a lot of sense when you think about when actually it is distracting. We can't keep on too many things at once, and ultimately, if that's what you want them to learn and know, then that task is not enabling to be successful, or if they're coming through and they can't actually write or transcribe themselves. And you see that in year 1 all the time. They come into year 1 and they haven't got the transcription skills, but they're writing about what they've done on the holidays. And actually they can't be successful because the design is initially setting them up to fail. And you're ultimately coming back, well, is this like a composition task? Is this a transcription task? Is this a phonics task? Well, what's the ultimate? Because actually some children can't be successful because we're not really sure. But it's what we all done once upon a time. And not that long ago, was it? Right, day 1, I'm going to get them to do a really bad piece of writing. I'm not going to give them any help, because when they come and look at the books at Christmas, the progress is going to be amazing. So I mean, go for it. And then they come in and be like, gosh, look where they were in September. They couldn't even do a capsulary full stop. Now look at them, and I'd like to say that's outstanding progress. Whereas it's funny because even, that sort of fizzled out. I know some schools will still look at progress like that, but, the inspector, figured out eventually that, well, we could play that game really well. And sometimes as a profession, we forget that wasn't that long ago. And then there are some schools. So having this change and this shift in this mentality is going to just naturally take people longer to understand and think about, because it just feels very different. And something that I'm sure some teachers will think, well, I got graded up, satisfactory, or it requires improvement, or inadequate because of my teacher talk and my task design, or it was too boring. Are now kind of, thinking, there's an irony with it. I think sometimes as a profession, we're quite quick to forget that it wasn't that long ago we were praising some of these things. It's interesting.
So, I mean, for anyone listening, they may be at the start of their journey and they're listening to this thinking, this is fantastic. I'm really going to throw me and my school into thinking about the curriculum. If they're just starting to rethink their sequencing, what advice would you give them to begin the process effectively?
Well, we've got this fantastic book, Kieran, that would be a great start for them. But no, I think it's complicated, as we've said. There it is. It's complicated, and it's messy, but it's really, really important work. And so I think one of the things that needs to happen, certainly at a senior leadership level, is there needs to be a kind of plan for how we're going to attack this. And you can't do everything all at once. You can't take on the whole of the primary curriculum. There are too many subjects, there's too many complexities. So I think you need to think about like your focus subjects. And we all know in schools that there will be some subjects that are taught better than others, and so there'll be those areas of priority that you can identify. Right, we've got to really do something about this. And I think it's about thinking, what do we want it to look like in the end? Having that really clear picture of like, where are we going with this? Who have we got? Like, what skills have we got within our team, that can help with this? And actually, if you haven't got the skills in your team, you could be a tiny rural school with like 3 teachers, then you've got to look elsewhere, and you've got to, bring some things in to support you with that. And that's not like a cop-out to say, well, we're just going to buy a curriculum off the shelf, because that curriculum will still need to be tailored to your school, to your locality, to the context within which you're working. There's still work to be done with that curriculum, but it can save so much time. If you can look out there and see, some great examples of good practice, if you can go to other schools and see, an example of a school that's got a really strong curriculum, and talk to them about, the journey that they've been on as well. Because, what we've been talking about, reducing teacher workload, but, we don't want senior leaders reinventing a curriculum in every single school. Like that's, it's too big a task. So I think it's about thinking about, what are my priorities? Which subjects are the priorities for this year and next year? And maybe you could have the sort of 3-year plan where you're going to go with it. And then also have that clear, what does good look like? How do we know what good looks like? Have we been and seen it? Have we talked to people? Have we, read things, etc. But yeah, it's complex, messy work, but I think it's like one of the most important things we can do to really make sure we're delivering for the children.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. The first thing is, don't reinvent the wheel. There's some skills doing some great stuff out there. So go and see what you can learn from them. I think work within the reality of your school. You will know your school better. If you are a school where Christmas nativities are a really important thing, and whether or not you're going to say it out loud, that actually everything was off the timetable for 2 or 3 weeks in the build up to that then factor that in realistically to your curriculum. Don't set them up, your teachers up to, be going on the timetable every single day if in reality that isn't what happens, because you're straight away off to not being able to cover everything. So I think, prioritize what you need to do. You can't do everything at once, and not everything's going to need to change at once. So if you've got some subjects that are doing well, leave them alone for the moment. You might be able to do them better, but if they're going okay at the moment, look at the 2 or 3 that maybe you really want to focus on. Give them time to give teachers that depth of understanding, to iron out any issues, iron out any challenges. I think when you're looking at, if you're looking at investing in curriculum materials, I'll always say is that you've got to remember, that person who wrote the maths curriculum, the religion curriculum, they're all different people, and they've overpacked it. And you're going to have to be realistic. And, if there's only X amount of lessons, you're going to have to cut something from that. Something's going to have to slide. So that's going to have to be made bespoke to your school, which is why I think having those step-by-steps are really important. And don't lose sight of your context. If you're looking at something like history, like local history is really important, and our local community are really important. And I think it's incredibly important that there might be something saying, oh, do the Great Fire of London because you're in London, you can use that as a local history. But ultimately, you might have something much more exciting and much more relevant. And within the book, we actually have done a chapter on sort of that diversity and that inclusion, because we think that's really important, that the children that we're serving, they should be able to see themselves within the curriculum. So that context is really key, that we are sort of reflecting maybe things that the children haven't yet experienced, but that success which is threaded through the curriculum, you should be deliberately making choices that the children can see kind of a mirror of, oh, that looks like me, or that sounds like me, or, that's like my mum or dad, or people in the community, and that sort of aspiration is there for all the community you're serving. So I think that's really key as well, that context is lose sight of that as well.
And I think really just to reassure schools that like it's never going to be perfect, it's never going to be finished, because the world is changing, and so the curriculum does need to reflect that, like, in some capacities. I'm reading the other day about the Stonehenge, and they discovered, they think that they used to say all the stones were from Wales, but they've actually found that they're from Scotland. so immediately I'm like, oh, we need to look at our Stone Age to Iron Age plans and start, thinking that, just editing and, improving. And so I think the work is never finished, but it shouldn't be, because it's got to reflect a changing world for the children we teach as well.
I don't know about the listeners, but I'm excited. I want to be starting to think about curriculum next week. But it's been absolutely lovely, guys. All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Kieran.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.